Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
Dunbar. All right, thank you, Dr. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. J. Keith Dunbar from Potentious. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to all of you today and share my next practice in how to achieve successful mergers and acquisitions through leadership due diligence. As Joffrey mentioned, my background is through University of Pennsylvania, where I got my doctorate from a joint program between the Graduate School of Education and the Wharton Business School. I know the introduction talked about me being a finalist for the Alliance of Merger and Acquisition Advisors Thought Leader of the Year Award. I actually won that award about 3 weeks ago, so we're very excited about that. And my career has really primarily been in the human resource talent management side, including several tours in the U.S. Navy where I performed this role. And in fact, I was stationed in Bahrain for a year back in the early 2000s, as an opportunity to work in the Middle East. So, as he mentioned, my work was recently published in the September 2014 issue of the Harvard Business Review titled "The Leaders That Make M&A Work." And you can actually get a copy of this article at my website for free, just on the front page of that, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that later. So companies involve a lot of things going on in their business in order to achieve one important thing, and that's growth. And what we've seen over the last year and what many consultancies are expecting later this year is that growth is going to be relatively flat. And so what many companies seek to do is they seek to drive growth inorganically by actually going out and either merging or acquiring other companies. And what these acquisitions really kind of look like are dependent on the left-hand vertical axis, the size of the company being acquired, and what you see down on the horizontal axis, the need to expand capability. So as companies make these acquisitions, they're looking to improve cost of their processes, improve cross-selling of existing products, or building new customer relationships, creating new products, or building a new business altogether. And what you find is that there's really 6 typical merger acquisitions out there. There's top left, you see overcapacity, where there may be a major competitor in the market by which acquiring that company will reduce capacity, therefore allowing more growth for that company. You also see product market consolidation in the top middle, and then transformation and convergence. So you use this deal to transform the way an industry works. And if you think of a merger and acquisition that's kind of like in that vein, think of AOL Time Warner as one of those transformational mergers and acquisitions that occurred back in the 2000s. Down along the bottom row, you see a roll-up, so a transfer of core strengths to target businesses or acquisition of products and markets specifically. So we see a lot of this in the food industry, where different food brands will be acquired by different companies. and then strategic growth, so they're seeking skill to transfer into new or non-core businesses, so areas where you have typically not operated in, but you see that as a growth opportunity, and so you move into that line of business. So those are kind of the types of M&A deals that you see out there initiated by lots of companies. What we saw earlier in 2014 was, my slides are not moving. One second. There we go. So this was the picture of M&A activity in 2014. So it was the biggest year in merger acquisition activity since 2007. There were nearly 43,000 M&A deals announced or executed in 2014 at a total value of almost $3.5 trillion. And this gives you, kind of an overall picture of areas where, regional areas. So we saw large increases in both North America, South America, in Europe, and Asia with the 43.4%. There was less M&A activity in Japan as well as the Middle East, Africa. And as we dive in a little deeper, we see, at least in the Middle East, Africa region, that there was about 50 billion total in inbound and outbound M&As this past year, with what you see as the increases between the different sectors of technology, media, telecommunications, energy, mining, and utilities, for example. And what this tells us is that it was a fairly active year in the Middle East. There was actually about a 23% increase over the 2013 numbers that we have. Specific to Saudi Arabia, since about 1991, we've seen a large amount of M&A activity between 2005 and 2006, where it was relatively low from a value of transactions perspective and has steadily increased since that time to what we saw this past year, where of the 50 billion in M&A activity in Saudi Arabia, about 15% of that was actually attributed to Saudi Arabia activity. So that kind of gives us, and this is actually another slide that talks about what M&A activity is expected to look like in the next 12 to 24 months. And the expectation is that there will be more activity in the oil, gas, the mining materials, and the real estate area as far as major sectors where there's an expectation of increased M&A activity in Saudi Arabia. And you see some comparisons there between other regions in the Gulf Cooperation Council. The expectation is also that at least in 2014, most of the merger acquisition activity was actually led by UAE, with Saudi Arabia in second and Qatar in third. So. And this was a piece from Ernst & Young talking about the 5 tips for M&A success in Saudi Arabia, which might be of interest. But from their perspective, deals take a little bit longer in Saudi Arabia. So it's important to be prepared to create these long-term relationships, and that'll be important as we talk about my research and kind of the importance of building relationships. Potential investors need to make sure they're aware of government thinking, as the public sector plays a key role in the kingdom's economy, so they have to stay abreast of those activities. Any type of extensive due diligence requires some preliminary research. People need to align their expectations over the timetable, And finally, appoint a decent set of advisors and don't strip on costs. And so, I think some of this is dictated by there's not a lot of M&A activity in Saudi Arabia, and so that's kind of where these tips are kind of based, is giving companies some ideas on how to handle that. So now let's talk about some research specific to mergers and acquisitions. So what we do know from the research is that about 70% of all mergers and acquisitions fail to meet their stated objectives or meet their expectations. And those expectations are typically around cost cutting, achieving synergies where you reduce duplication of effort between the two companies, as well as increase customer marketplace achievements. Of those, about 50% of those actually destroy shareholder value, as you see down in the bottom of this graphic. But the perspective of most CEOs is that their acquisitions are extremely successful. So it gives you kind of this reality base that while these things are undertaken for very major goals, the reality is that they sometimes struggle, and we'll talk more about why that is shortly. So this was an interesting piece done by Ian Hewitt back in 2011, specific about culture integration in mergers and acquisitions. And they asked respondents to identify the top 10 reasons why M&As fail. And what you see is that these were kind of broadly aggregated into these three large buckets of strategy, people, and due diligence integration. And a lot of research tends to point towards the specific idea that most M&As don't fail because of financial or business-related issues. It's really around the people, and so that's why you see 5 of these being kind of aggregated in the people category. But the reality is that while all of these are attributed to M&A failure, there are some key words that you see highlighted there: failure to implement, strategy, leadership infighting, a lack of execution capability, competency, workforce people issues, cultural integration. And what that kind of has caused us is to take something of a unique perspective about mergers and acquisitions, and that's specific that we believe that the foundational aspect of why a merger and acquisition will be successful or less successful at meeting their stated objectives is really based on the leadership that you find in either the acquirer or the target company. And we also have, another unique perspective about this is that while much of the time is spent focused on senior executives in the acquiring company or the target company, we believe that these are major change events for both organizations, the acquirer and the target company. And in major change events, you require leadership throughout the organization in order to affect the type of change that is both efficient and effective at meeting whatever the change is. And in this case, we've talked about the merger acquisition changes being around new markets, maintaining customers, maintaining talent within the organizations. One of the key aspects of a lot of the acquisitions that take place in Silicon Valley are what they call acqui-hires. So it's not necessarily that they're acquiring these companies for the product that they have, but they're acquiring these companies for the engineering talent that resides in these companies. And so all of these things kind of play a factor in why leadership is critically important to successful M&As, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that now. So my research at the University of Pennsylvania was really focused in I wanted to do something around leadership and organizational performance, and I needed to really kind of narrow that down because it was a very broad topic. And as I read about mergers and acquisitions, what I came to realize was that in large part leadership is often ignored or denied in mergers and acquisitions, and that is historically because it has never been quantified. So there was never any research that looked at quantifying the impact of leadership on successful or less successful mergers and acquisitions. So it really provided an opportunity for me to kind of dive deep into this and to try to gain some insights that could help CEOs and corporate teams to, change the odds from 70% fail to meet stated objectives to 70% meet stated objectives. So these were the two key questions I wanted to know. I wanted to know what leadership areas and leadership competencies predict M&A success, as well as I had this very broad data set that included individual contributors all the way up to C-suite executives. And what we find in most mergers and acquisitions is that there's a strict focus on the senior executives in the target company and not middle management in the target company nor in the acquiring company. And so we wanted to know, do senior executives or middle managers' leadership capabilities have a greater effect on M&A success as well? And so what came out of that was we looked at a set of 14 leadership competencies in 4 leadership areas. So there was strategic, and within that were competencies like use sound judgment, think strategically, innovate, and provide direction. There were also outcomes. So the focus on customer needs, managing execution, drive for results, and establish plans. Networking, which was around building relationships, influencing, motivating others, developing others, and finally individual leadership. So the ability to act with integrity and build trust and show adaptability. And what we really expected to find was that, this is the world of business. So the decisions that are being made about mergers and acquisitions are very strategic decisions, and it's focused on business outcomes. And so that's what we kind of thought going into this, is that we would find that most of the strategic and outcomes-based leadership competencies would predict M&A success, and we were really surprised to find that that wasn't the case. So for acquirers, there were a core set of 7 leadership skills that predict M&A success, and within those were the ability to focus on customer needs, motivate, influence, developing others within the company, building relationships, acting with integrity, and showing adaptability. And we'll talk more about these in a few minutes specifically. But we really found that is surprising. So all of the network leadership skills were predictors, and both of the individual leadership skills were predictors, whereas only one of the business of the outcome and none of the strategic were predictors. For the target company, there were a group of 4. So the ability to provide direction, so one of the strategic leadership competencies, and then again, you see here, motivate, influence, and build relationships, which came from the networking leadership area. So within the acquire and the target company, they shared 3 key skills of the ability to build relationships, influencing others, and motivating others, and we'll talk more about that. Regarding the second question of whether senior executives or middle managers have a greater effect on M&A success, for acquirers, we got what we were kind of expecting. It was senior executives. So the ability of senior executives to have the right sets of skills at the right levels is very important. But for target companies, it was different. it was the middle management had a greater effect. And if you think, if you have any experience in M&As or you've read anything about M&As, this kind of makes a lot of sense. So within the target company, the focus, again, is typically on senior executives that the acquiring company might want to retain for up to 3 years to ensure that there's a smooth transition and integration of the target company. But it's really the middle management that has to stay involved with a company and keep the employees engaged, motivated, and moving forward as this very big change event, which creates lots of ambiguity and uncertainty for employees, kind of plays out. What we have seen in the research is that a lot of that is driven by the speed of the integration. And because the speed of the integration is typically not very fast, if you've ever been in a company where something's happening and there's very little information, that's how rumors start. And so in this case, middle managers play a really big role in making sure that employees stay focused, that they have the information that they need in order to make decisions and to continue to stay productive for the company. And as we found in our research, the leadership profile has a big impact. So the financial metric that we used in our research was around total shareholder return versus the large cap index. And in my data set, there were 94 mergers and acquisitions between 2004 and 2008. And what we did is the data that we had for the leadership assessment data was the 2 years before the M&A deal was final. The financial metric of total shareholder return was based on 2 years after the merger was final. So the 2-year point was used assuming that by 2 years that the acquisition or the merger was fully integrated and the company was operating as one company instead of two companies. And so what that allowed us to do was to compare the acquiring companies' total shareholder return against their large cap index of the country that they were in. So for example, a U.S. company would be compared against the S&P 500. A British or French company would be compared to the CAC or the FTSE. So what came out of that was that acquirers that had the M&A leadership profile of the 7 leadership skills had total shareholder return that was positive 10.4% on average. For those companies that did not have the M&A leadership profile, their total shareholder return against their large cap was negative 17.3%. So a huge difference there played by companies that had the right leadership profile versus those companies that did not have that leadership profile. And so that kind of leads us to this concept of what does the current best practice model look like for a leadership assessment. Because as we identify these core sets of skills for the acquirer and the target company, what that kind of meant to us is that there was the potential for a new model of what leadership assessment could and should look like inside of the M&A space. And so typically what you find is that there's a focus on senior executives of the target company. On the outside, maybe some leadership within the acquiring company to determine who is going to run the new business unit that this acquisition creates. There's typically a battery of psychological assessments that the individual leaders will be put through, and on average these assessments cost anywhere from $10,000 to $12,000 per person, depending on the level and the number of assessments. not focus on typically is the acquire leadership, and it doesn't focus on target middle management in any way. And again, we took this perspective that collective leadership within an organization is really a key determinant of whether a merger and acquisition is going to be successful because of this major change event that's taking place within both of the organizations. And understanding that allows you to create a new model of what leadership assessment looks like within a merger and acquisition. And it's not to say that you would stop doing what you see here as the current best practice in leadership assessment, because it is important to know whether you have the right person with the right skill sets that thinks and uses information properly, as an example, running your business. But it's also important to understand, do you have the leadership capability within both organizations that are going to allow for a successful, efficient, and effective integration after the acquisition is final. So what came out of our work is what we consider the next practice, which is the M&A leadership framework. And if you remember earlier, I was speaking about the importance of, that in large part, leadership in M&As is denied or ignored. And the reason for that is that it had never been quantified, and our research did the quantification and tied the impact of leadership to financial performance. But there was also never an actionable framework available to compare what leadership should look like in a successful merger and acquisition, including the acquiring the target, and what it does look like within a company. So understanding that this framework is now available, what this allows is for companies to actually look at their leadership capability within the two companies and ascertain the level of risk that might be involved in any particular merger and acquisition taking place. We also like to talk about the story that this framework tells us. So, for example, we believe that the core piece of whether an acquirer can achieve the results that they want is the ability to act with integrity and build trust within the target company. If an acquirer is unable to build trust through acting with integrity, the three shared leadership skills between the target and the acquirer, building relationships, influencing others, and motivating others, is going to be very difficult to achieve. When there's trust between two people, the ability to build relationships is much improved. And the same thing applies within the M&A context. If an acquirer can establish trust, they are in a better position to build relationships between them and the target company. And if they are able to build relationships, then they are in a better position to also influence and motivate employees and leaders throughout both organizations for the successful integration and conclusion of this particular merger and acquisition. Additionally, you see these outer ring of leadership skills. So focusing on the target company first and provide direction. We had talked where middle managers are more important to M&A success. And what we believe is that the ability of middle managers to provide that direction to employees is really the key aspect of why these M&As are successful. With regards to the acquiring company and these three leadership skills of show adaptability, focus on customers, and develop others, the show adaptability piece is really important because again, these are very ambiguous, uncertain, and highly volatile situations. So the ability of leaders in the acquiring company to show adaptability, to be able to take incomplete information and make decisions based on that to speed up the integration is important. Developing others is the ability of these companies to really build the capability internal to their organization to continue to effectively do mergers and acquisitions, and we'll talk about one company that does this really well here shortly. And finally, the focus on customers. So one thing that does happen whenever a major acquisition is announced is that you can count on your competitors are calling the customers of the target company in order to see if they want to switch. And so what we find is that companies that are very successful at acquisitions are able to communicate and focus not only on their customers, but also the customers of the target company to ensure that they keep them included in as clients of theirs going forward. So what this leads is to a very refined approach for M&A leadership risk assessment. So our approach is very good, in fact, that it leverages existing leadership assessment data, that you can collate that data, you then analyze from the acquire and the target perspective, and then compare this data with M&A leadership risk profiles that we have created from our work that allow you to look at where the acquire and the target may be above average or below average, for example. So let's take a look at a couple of case studies and how they kind of played out with respect to the acquirer skills. So in February 2006, there was a acquisition by a merger of SO Iceland and Villanos. In this merger, the merger was announced in February 2006. They were two different companies on Iceland. So SO Iceland was a full-service fuel provider, while Villanos was an automotive spare parts retailer. And Herman Gudmundsson was actually the CEO of Villanos, who ended up becoming the new CEO of this merged company in Iceland. So the key challenges that he faced within the merger were around concerns about destroying shareholder value. And as you remember earlier on when we talked about the myths involved in, or the truth in the myths of M&As, up to 50% of M&As destroy shareholder value. So he had that on his mind. He was also keen to the cross-selling enablement. So SO Iceland was about fuel distribution, and he's about automotive spare parts. So he was interested about the ability of these two companies to actually, so fuel service providers to sell automotive parts, for example. He wanted a better idea of the management talent that he also had in the new organization. So from a due diligence and integration perspective, what type of leadership capability did he have in this company that would enable him to affect the change that he wanted to see? He also noticed that there was a lack of collaboration between the two companies. So again, two kind of separate cultures, two different perspectives. And finally, there had been a price-setting case against SO Iceland, which had a major impact on SO Iceland and was something that he was going to have to deal with. So what he identified as he looked at management strengths was SO Iceland was much more strategic than Villanos. They were comfortable planning and executing on very large programs, but they were cautious by nature. So they were somewhat risk-averse and, had to have lots of information in order to move forward with a plan or an idea. Villanos, on the other hand, was very adaptable. They had a customer focus, and they were less proficient at implementing medium or large-scale programs. So you can kind of see right off the bat that while these are management strengths of both of these companies in this case, there was the potential of clash because they looked at things from a different perspective, and that could be a challenge for a successful merger. So here are the impacts of the 7 acquired skills that we identified in our research. So, and the key here was Villanos or SO Scotland able to overcome these issues with the right sets of leadership skills? So the focus on customer needs was a core competency of Villanos. So they knew that the ability of their success in Iceland was dependent upon their ability to focus on what their customers needed and wanted in the right quantities at the right times. The ability to motivate others. So they initiated an effort to identify the right managers that were exhibiting enthusiasm and workshops to obtain employee ideas. So this is a standard approach in integration practices to actually engage the 2 groups of employees to ensure that the new firm is taking into account the ideas and the best practices from both organizations. Develop others. So they built workshops to learn from each company, and Villanos was learning from SO Iceland specifically on the management of large-scale projects. The ability to influence others, so the understanding the need to gain consensus with employees, which are part of the reason for the workshops at obtaining employee ideas. Building relationships, so while these workshops were intended to obtain employee ideas, they were also had the opportunity to allow employees to build relationships and collaborate with one another between the 2 companies. Act with integrity, so the culture of trust and integrity established by Gudmundsson at Villanos was important. And finally, the workshops again were a key component to improve the trust. And finally, show adaptability. The Villanos managers had that. So in this case, where you would want to mitigate risk between Villanos and SO Iceland is the fact that leaders within Villanos had this capability. So you want to match them up with leaders in SO Iceland that could also show adaptability and improve on the performance of the overall company. So what we know about the financial performance is a private company, so we're not sure what the overall performance was, but according to what we were able to find out by October 2008, EBITDA was on way to doubling, and cross-selling had gained traction. So now let's look at Cisco. So Cisco is one of the most active acquiring companies in the U.S. So they're prolific at this, what you would consider a serial acquirer. So they've made over 173 acquisitions since 1993 at about $71.4 billion in deals, just the announced deal values, as they've made a number of acquisitions with privately held companies as well. So Cisco has a target screening principle, so they've, over the years, been able to establish this very specific M&A competency set. So what they look for in their screening principles is there a presence of a shared vision between Cisco and the target company? Is there a likelihood of short-term mutual wins for the 2 companies? Long-term mutual win for all parties? Is there the right chemistry or cultural compatibility, reasonable geographic proximity, and additionally, what are the management key style focus areas? So with regards to the 7 key competencies and Cisco has an obsessive focus on customers, so ensuring that they understand their customer needs. So this is a key capability that Cisco brings to any acquisition. The ability to motivate others, so Cisco basically has this visa of introducing team spirit and desire to change things. The ability to influence others, so Cisco assigns a manager as a mentor to new managers in the acquired company in order to communicate values and the way of doing things at Cisco. With regards to developing others, this is coaching of managers and a focus on innovation and learning within Cisco. The ability to build relationships through these mentor activities that Cisco engages in. The act with integrity. So Cisco focuses on being very upfront with acquiring employees and being sure to tell them exactly what's going on. And so that helps to build trust and finally show adaptability. So this rapid adaptation is crucial to their success overall. They also, in their HR due diligence, look at management style, org structure, cultural issues. And what we've seen is that their financial performance between 2019 and 2014 is 19.6% versus 3.38% on S&P 500. So they've been fairly successful in their acquisition strategy. So wrapping up, M&As are a key strategy for inorganic growth and will continue to be so in 2015 as there's expected to be greater M&A activity in 2015, just like what we saw in 2014. Leadership is the root cause of M&A success or failure, and we again take this perspective, and even though culture gets most of the attribution of why M&As fail in this culture clash issue, what we believe is if you have the right leadership skills in both organizations and you know exactly what those are, and you're able to leverage those leadership strengths or mitigate the leadership risk, you can change the results that you see in any particular M&A. Again, M&As are major change events where collective leadership capability is the key to success or failure. Historically, impact of leadership is ignored or denied by most M&A advisors and consultants. And finally, an actionable M&A leadership framework allows for leadership due diligence to quantify these skills and to ensure ability to achieve your financial objectives. So I want to thank you for your kind attention today. If you're interested in following what I write about, you can follow us at potentious.com. My blog, DNA of Human Capital, off that page, and I'm happy to connect with you either on Twitter or LinkedIn or Google+. With that, I turn it back over to Ali Zafir.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dunbar. Folks, if you have any questions now, this is the Q&A time, so you could either raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your webinar console. If you click on it, you can speak to Dr. Dunbar directly, or you could put your questions in the question box. I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. Let me go straight to the question box. There are a couple of good questions, so let me go straight. First one, during friendly and unfriendly mergers and acquisitions, two important issues normally not receive sufficient attention from ethical perspective. One has to do with the rights of employees affected in mergers and acquisition, and the second one concerns the responsibilities of shareholders during these activities. Could you please share your views on how should leadership address such issues on ethical grounds?
Yeah, so I think that kind of that's a great question. So that really gets back to the act with integrity competency. So, with respect to employees, the ability of an acquirer to act with integrity, and so the example we shared was Cisco and their ability to be very upfront with the target company about what's going on, how the acquisition will go, whether or not there will be employee cuts, for example. That, while it's still bad news for employees, employees would rather you be truthful and honest with them up front about what the objectives of the acquisition is, vice kind of not being honest and forthright with what are the key aspects. So, for example, here in the U.S., two big office supply companies, Staples and Office Depot, announced a couple, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago that Staples was going to buy Office Depot. I think that's the direction this was going. And, in the joint press announcement, they specifically said they were looking for up to $1 billion in synergies in the first year. Well, that's a code word for cost cutting, and in any kind of M&A cost cutting will include, obviously, manufacturing, people, those kinds of things. But I think that's why it's most important that acquirers are very upfront with the target that they're acquiring, because the less uncertainty that there is for employees in a target company, the more likely they are to stay. And keeping talent within acquisitions is a considerable cases. With regards to the shareholder piece, it's been kind of an interesting year in 2014. So typically what has happened when an acquirer announces that they're making an acquisition, the target company stock goes up immediately, and usually the acquiring company's stock takes a hit. And what that usually means is that it goes down because most people have historically, they understand that acquisitions are very risky activities, and so they kind of are expecting that it's not going to be successful. What companies found in 2014, however, was that the target company got the huge bump up, as was typical, but the acquiring company also got a bump up. So this year, shareholders viewed acquisitions more favorably. And we think in large part that was due to, a lot of acquisition activity was tied to, access to cheap debt. Companies had large stockpiles of cash, and shareholders reacted favorably to that. But again, I think that's also a case of the ability of acquirers to be very truthful and forthright with their shareholders about why they're making these acquisitions and why they think it's absolutely vital to their business strategy and their growth. So, good question.
Okay. Thank you. We have one more interesting question. Mergers can be driven by generalized fear, such as globalization, the arrival of new technological developments, etc., could create a strong incentive for defensive mergers. This could leave leadership with no choice but to acquire a rival before being acquired. Coping with such merger can make leadership spread their time too thinly and neglect their core business, coming to. What would you advise in coping up with such a fear?
So that's another good question. So, I can speak from experience with some companies that I've worked with, and in this case, it wasn't an acquisition, but it was actually taking a company and splitting it into two companies. And what took place from that is that we became so internally focused on the split of the company that we lost focus about our customers. And as we talked about early on, the focus on customer needs is really important because, again, it's typically one of the main reasons that you're making an acquisition is to gain access to a new market segment or customer set. And so it can't be overemphasized that your ability to focus on customers, to make sure that they are they understand what the acquisition is, why the acquisition is happening, and how the acquisition is going to affect them is really important. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, well, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give, Dr. Dunbar, before we dismiss out?
No, I just want to say thank you to everyone for taking time to listen to this. And again, if you are in the market to make acquisitions in 2015, I would urge you to really kind of think about, do you really have the leadership skills within your organization to make this successful? And as you look at particular acquisitions, do they have the right sets of leadership skills to make it successful? So thank you for your time. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much once again. I would like to especially thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE, for your time and for giving a very valuable presentation. And folks, all of you who participated in this webinar, we really want to thank you also, with the note that please do tune to palm.mile.org, which is our upcoming flagship program to be commenced in Madinah in the month of April. It's going to be lasting for 2 weeks, and we are inviting world-class speakers from all top academic schools who are coming here to deliver the workshops. So please do stay tuned to palm.mile.org to learn more about this program. And thank you once again. We are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded in the next couple of days, so stay tuned to community.mile.org. Thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.